Hi, it's Tony and Rob here, co-founders of Great Ideaz. And today we wanted to talk about trellispark and why trellispark is really great for developers. So, first thing I'm going to ask you, Tony, is why developers like trellispark? Is it fun? There's something about it that makes them really enjoy using the product?
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is that we are developers. I mean, I personally have been writing code since 1980, and I love still getting my hands dirty and writing code. We have a company value that we call relentless innovation. So as a team, our developers are constantly looking at new technologies and bringing them into our product as components that are available for other developers using trellispark to pick up and use. This means that we're always using the latest technologies. At the moment, we're doing a lot of work with .NET 5. By the end of this year, we'll be working with .NET 6. We're rebuilding all of our main web presentation components using Blaze. Next year, we're going to be into Maui for desktops and mobile applications. So as developers, we really love using the latest technologies. And I know a lot of developers out there feel the same way, right? We don't want to be using stuff that's 15 years old, 20 years old. We really want to be at the cutting edge using the latest tools, the latest techniques, the latest components. And that's what trellispark delivers on. And this makes it really easy for a developer to add new functionality or new capabilities to an application and deliver a real wow to the customers, right? So to the people who are using our applications. I mean, one of the things as a developer that's really rewarding is when, you get the wow, right? You go to the user and you show them the new application, show them the new functionality, and they're like, wow, I really didn't think you could do that. That looks brilliant. So this is the key trellispark promise, right? It's always about relentless innovation. It's always about new technology. It's about new functionality that enables you as a developer to deliver a wow to the people who are using your product.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about this, wow factor and what is it that allows developers to get to that wow kind of factor as far as the user experience quickly, and what is it that the developers focus on? So if you're using the trellispark framework and the product as a developer, what is it that it releases you from having to have to do? I guess some of the stuff that often developers don't like to work with or use or do, and the stuff that actually they can really focus their energy on. How does that work, and what's trellispark letting them do in that way?
Okay, so one of the key aspects of trellispark is that we build it on the idea of data agnostic services. And this allows us to eliminate all of the code that you would normally build for a create, read, update, delete function. Because we're storing data agnostically, we're not creating lots of tables, lots of columns, lots of stored procedures. We're not creating lots of business logic classes and then lots and lots of forms where all you're doing day in, day out is say, I've got a table called policy. It's got a field called start date. Great. Now I've got the stored procedure for that. Now I've got the business logic for that. Now I've got the forms for that. So our use of the data agnostic framework has eliminated 90% plus of the boring CRUD code that a developer would normally have to write. So the things where they're having to focus on, did I get that table name right? Did I get that column name right? Have I copied the variable across my stored procedures, my logic, my forms correctly, and then debugging all of that, right? All of that has been completely eliminated by the trellispark framework. This means that what's really required from a developer is just a focus on the delivery of strategic value. So the automation of workflow. So what happens when you press that button on an invoice that says submit invoice or process payment, right? We don't have to worry about writing the CRUD UX. That's already there for you in trellispark. What we really need you to focus on is just that piece of workflow, that 10, 20 lines, 100 lines of code that allows you to deliver value using that.
Now, I mean, the other part to this is it's one thing to, I guess, kind of free up a developer's ability to not focus on the, the create, read, update, delete, kind of more of the mundane elements of creating and writing code, and then focus strategically on that stuff. But what is it about trellispark that gives them a lot of control and the ability to do what they actually want to do? I mean, there are a lot of frameworks out there that are low code, no code products and stuff like that, where they do have the ability to eliminate a lot of that kind of basic code that they would need to write. But there's certainly limitations around what the developer would be able to do with that framework. How is that different with trellispark?
With trellispark, we open up everything to the developer. It's not a closed box, right? It's not like you're trying to deliver, a Microsoft Dynamics solution where there are just a couple of ways that you can deliver functionality, either in client side with JavaScript or in the back end, with a DLL, right? We open everything up from the database right the way through to the front end Blazor UX components. So from a developer's perspective, they can change anywhere. What's the most effective optimization? What's the most effective delivery of that business value? The other thing that we do is we make sure that within the framework, there is a very clear separation of concerns. Everything has one purpose, and it's very easy to take one of those functions and swap it out. Right, so if I need to swap out my functionality for processing an invoice, I don't need to execute a complete system integration test again. I can basically go in, I can change the 20 lines of code that are dealing with processing the invoice, I can redeploy that code, and I know that I have not impacted anything else. And what's even more fun is that I know that somebody else working on how they process an order is not going to impact me. All right, so one of the really cool things when you're working with larger development teams, particularly with traditional development practices, is one person might be working on, say, a policy, adding some new fields, and that work may inadvertently break your code that's doing the bind or commit of the policy, right? And that happens all the time as developers. With the trellispark framework, that does not happen to anything like the same extent, because we've separated out all of the different functions into very discrete blocks. It makes it easy for developers to pick it up, learn the framework, implement the functionality they want, test it, and deploy it.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about that then, because one of the other things that we often hear from developers that are picking up a framework is that, well, they don't want to pick up a framework that could potentially be a challenge for them down the road. So how does the trellispark framework address things like security and scalability and the robustness of the technology and the solution as to how they would implement it and use it for building out different types of web portals and solutions?
So that's a great question, Rob. As a developer, I know that most developers want to take ownership of the solutions that they're expected to deliver to their businesses. They want the freedom and control to be able to host their solution where they want, whether it's on-prem or in the cloud, whether it's on a physical server, a virtual server, or they're using a platform as a service, so like Azure SQL instead of deploying their own SQL server. So as developers, we really want to own our destiny as far as these applications are concerned, especially business critical applications where you've got a C-suite executive breathing down your neck. Why isn't this working? Why isn't this fast enough? Can you make this faster? Can you do this? Right? We want ownership. We want control. So one of the great things about trellispark is it's not a boxed solution that there's only one way to deploy it. You can deploy it in any scenario where you can drop a database, either in PaaS or in infrastructure, where you can drop a website, again, either in PaaS or on infrastructure. It's completely up to you. Host it where you like, anyhow you like.
So, I mean, the other thing around this is there's one thing around being able to have the autonomy to be able to do any kind of deployments, any kind of infrastructure deployments that they want. But what else does trellispark allow them to do as far as the freedom to be able to customize or adapt or change the framework itself?
Well, again, as a developer, I want to be able to customize pretty much everything, right? Because that's where I deliver my wow. So we actually provide two forms of the trellispark product out of the box to developers. We give them a compiled version that runs, that provides the user experience using essentially the Great Ideaz color scheme and how we would like to render our controls internally. But we also give them the source code for all of those Blazor components as well. So it's totally up to the developer whether or not they use our initial development standards and how our particular controls look and work, or whether or not they want to rework them themselves. So we give the developers total freedom in the data presentation layer to be able to re-render the user experience using their own branding, their own logos, and even changing the look and feel of any part of the user experience. So they have total control of the user experience.
Yeah, that's really powerful. So they can essentially take whatever we have as part of the out of box kind of components and everything that's in trellispark, but then they could swap that out. They could potentially implement their own extensions or adapt the user experience in a completely different way that's totally custom to what they want.
Exactly. So, for example, if they're writing their own policy management system and they're dealing with vehicles and they want to create a user control that takes a vehicle identification number, goes to an external website, pulls down a ton of information about the vehicle, renders it all inside a user control, and then writes it to the database, they have the total flexibility to be able to extend and add that component within the framework of the solution as a whole. It is totally open-ended from that perspective.
Okay, so let's go back then to that flexibility and look at it then in the lens of how does this framework ensure that the solution is going to be secure? How does it ensure that it's robust, it has scalability? Like, what is it in the framework itself that can deal with those sorts of aspects of it? And how scalable is this platform? How big can they actually grow it?
So trellispark is, as you say, a lightweight framework that we've been maturing for years now, if not decades. My initial work was in the military, working for building secure weapons systems and database systems for highly sensitive projects. And I learned how to build systems securely back in the 90s. And every year, something new comes out, some new innovation comes out, some new threat vector comes out that we have to take into account. And year over year, we have built those capabilities into the trellispark framework. And we continue to innovate to build more and more secure and robust systems. So as new threats emerge, for example, ransomware, we've been looking at how does the trellispark framework mitigate or reduce the vulnerability of an organization to ransomware attacks. And that's just baked in. So if you're looking as a developer for a good primer on how to build a secure system, then trellispark gives you an excellent education in how to actually develop secure and stable code. We also partition all of our code, so it's highly robust. We put in a bunch of error handling and error tracking. So if something does go wrong, there is an event log that's generated that allows you to drill down to within 10 or 20 lines of code within the framework to tell you what failed, why it failed, and give you a point where you have control over how you're rolling back that transaction, how you're reporting the fact that there is a problem. And then if you're a developer in debugging, you can obviously then go in and fix that bug. So one of the really cool things about the trellispark framework is it makes it really easy as a developer to isolate, resolve, and fix bugs. From a scalability perspective, again, I've worked on everything from banking systems through to social media systems where potentially you have millions of users. So we've built this trellispark framework to be both horizontally and vertically scalable. So vertically scalable is where you're just adding bigger and bigger servers. So I've got an 8-core server, a 16-core server, a 32-core server, and at some point you run out of vertical scaling, right? There is a limit to the amount of memory, disk, and CPU you can put on an individual server. So we also made the framework horizontally scalable. So I can add additional servers at will as far as possible. And part of the data agnostic framework approach that we use basically allows us to extend that horizontal scalability even into the data layer, which I think is unique in these sorts of systems. And then the really cool thing about this is the whole point is it is a lightweight framework. One of the things that we wanted to do with trellispark is make it easy for a developer to be able to pick this up, understand it, and apply it correctly with minimum reading and background information. So it's not complex, it's not hard to learn. It's something that any competent developer can pick up and use. And we routinely bring in co-op students from our local college, and we bring them up to speed with this framework within 2 or 3 weeks.
Now, the other thing that I'd like to zero in on in that thread and what you were saying is the database scalability and horizontal scaling within the database in the back end, because certainly a lot of the platforms out there, they don't allow you to really do anything with the database in the back end, especially if it's a SaaS-based solution or something like that. But what is trellispark? Why is it unique when it comes to the scaling abilities and the attributes of trellispark when it comes to the database horizontal scaling?
So this is a really cool thing about data agnostic record storage. Essentially, you're dealing with an instances table, an instance access table, and an instance history table. That's the core of what's happening in terms of how data is actually being stored as records in the database. Now, the only access to that information is through a REST API that can itself be horizontally scaled. So when we're trying to store a record, an instance within the database, we can put that instance in any sort of storage mechanism we want. We could use, say, Cosmos DB in Azure. We can scale it across multiple Azure SQL databases or multiple database servers. And as the information comes in, we can say, well, this concept goes over in this database storage. This other concept goes over here. This concept, we've got billions of these. So what we'll do is we'll partition those by the instance GUIDs that define the records, and we'll scale those across 10 other database servers if we need to. So essentially, this capability of divorcing the interface for the data agnostic record storage from the actual backing store of information means that we can put the information in any database server that we want. And then when we're querying that information, we can pull that information together from multiple databases and return a single result set. So this gives us tremendous capability to horizontally scale the database layer. And this just isn't possible with a traditional relational database design. Now, if you say got a policy management system with 1,000 interrelated database tables where you've got a whole bunch of triggers and constraints between the tables, how do you scale that across 2 databases? I mean, it's impossible to pull the thing apart and rebuild the application. With data agnostic record storage, the application doesn't even know you've done it.
Wow, very, very cool. Okay, so we talked about a lot of different things. We talked about the why it's fun, basically, like all the different aspects around the latest technologies and what they can use, and how we're always having this relentless innovation where we're constantly putting in new technologies. But then they have the autonomy to do that as well. They have the ability to add and enhance and do different things. They certainly have a lot more control around the user experience. We've talked about being able to host it anywhere and be able to deploy it in any way they want, whether it's a platform as a service or virtual servers or just a traditional on-premise infrastructure within their own data center. We've talked about the lightweight framework aspect of it, where we've got the scalability and the robustness and all of these things, which is all very, very cool. The horizontal scaling, even in the database backend, is a powerful attribute of trellispark that's rather unique. Okay, we've talked about all these things. What about support? How is it that I mean, certainly as a developer, it's incredibly frustrating if you're working with a technology or a tool and you hit a wall and you don't know what to do. How do we support developers that are working with trellispark? Can they ask you questions? How does that work?
Okay, so trellispark is a lightweight framework built by developers for developers, right? This is a fundamental aspect of what trellispark is. So as well as trellispark itself, we're giving you the source code to the data presentation layer. We're giving you, documentation as it relates to the fundamental framework and architecture of the solution as a whole. We're giving you access inside the database. We're giving you a lot of information that will help you understand how trellispark at an architectural level works and how you can take ownership of it and deploy it. To support that, as well as giving you access to a lot of the underlying source code, we're also giving you a lot of videos and technical reference materials so that you can understand in detail how it works. In addition to that, if you have a problem with the product or with the trellispark framework, or you have questions, then you can open tickets with us at Great Ideaz, and typically we'll be able to respond to your questions in less than 24 hours.
Awesome. Well, that's great. Well, thank you so much, Tony, for walking through all of these things and explaining, what is the power of trellispark when it comes to developers and how they can use it and work with it. To learn more about Great Ideaz products and solutions, visit greatideaz.com. That's Great Ideaz with a Z.com. Thanks.